Hello everybody. This is the first video in my hopefully pretty big series of videos that I'm going to be putting out about my top 12 favorite albums of the decade. And so when I say decade, of course, I mean from 2010 through all the way through 2019. And so while this is my first video, this is not the first step I have taken. The first step I did was to create this lovely spreadsheet, which you see behind me here. And I apologize while you're watching the video if you can't see this that clearly. I will be zooming in on it a little bit during the video. But I tried to think of a good way to do this, and with all that I have that's available to me, projecting it onto just our TV was the best way I could see to do it. So I apologize if it's not that clear or easily understandable, but you'll just have to listen to me regardless and trust that what I'm saying is accurate. So, as if we take a look at this graph here, which like I said, I will zoom into it in a second, we have my top 12 albums from the years 2010 all the way through 2019. And then you can see in the last little vertical column here, I have a column I've labeled Discovered Later. And so what that means is there's 9 albums in this column, and they are albums that I discovered after the year that they came out, which means that I couldn't have had them on my list. So for example, I believe Hurt's Exile came out 2 years after the first Hurt's album that I discovered in 2011, so that would have been the 2013. That album didn't make it on my list because I didn't know about it during the time frame when I made that list. So, but these albums I think are deserving of being at least mentioned and being included with this particular graph. That doesn't mean that I think all of those albums are going to make it in my top 12, but I just think that they deserve to be there. And to find those, I simply went through my entire catalog of CDs, which includes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of CDs. And I tried to find albums that I thought were some of my favorites, albums that I keep going back to constantly to keep listening to. And then I checked the date on them. And if they came out in this decade, I included them in there. So I'm sure I'm maybe missing one or two, but I think I did a pretty thorough job of going through everything. So for the purpose of this video, like I said, this is my first video, second step after making this. This is just going to be a very preliminary thing here to sort of get people warmed up for my actual list. This is not going to be making the whole list. My goal with this video is to kind of narrow it down to the top 20 or so. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through this list, and I'm going to highlight the ones in light blue that I think are going to be definitely on the list. And then if I have encounter a few that I think might be on the list, I'll have to kind of fight with myself over it. We're going to make those light pink. So I have my laptop right here in front of me, if you can see, and I'm going to just go through and kind of discuss what we got going on. So let's zoom in here and just start right away with 2010. Whoops. And just start with 2010. No, you dumb. Okay, so zoomed in a little bit, and I apologize if I'm leaning in front of this. I'll try to be aware of that while we're recording. So starting with 2010, we have actually what is actually one of the strongest years overall of the whole decade. And obviously the one that I've thought about the least in the last 10 years because it's the oldest. So it's fun to kind of go back and look at this stuff. And I should mention before we get too deep into this that I went through and I set up this spreadsheet inputting all the data, but I tried not to think too hard about what was going to be on my list. I was trying to think about the top 5 or so because I don't really know what I'm going to do in terms of how to number those. So I've been kind of listening to certain albums over the last few weeks to kind of get ready for this, but I haven't sat down and done any of this yet. So you're just experiencing this with me for the first time. So this is just going to kind of be some of my thoughts, a little bit raw and unfiltered here, to just kind of see what ends up in being at least in my top 20, and then I'll narrow it down from there in possible future videos. So in 2010, we have a bunch of really good stuff. We have Pendulum, BT, and Black Keys are the top 3. And I think all 3 of those are actually going to make it into the list, possibly. I definitely think Pendulum, which we will make light blue, and BT are going to make the list. So we'll make those light blue. Now, Black Keys are going to be on this list as a whole a couple times. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about that, and what we're going to find a lot of interesting things about all these albums as we go through, is that normally when I do my lists, it's just for one particular year, as you can see here. And so I rarely ever have to deal with the idea that one band that I enjoy releases multiple albums in a year. That's happened a couple times. Last year in 2019, Demon Hunter and Foals both released 2 albums in the year, and I just sort of, to cheat my way around it, I thought of them as a double album and just included them as one. Neither of those albums are going to make it onto this, so I don't think we're going to have that problem with this particular list. However, I now have to go and think about something like, well, I know that I have 2 Black Keys albums in this decade that came out that I loved. Brothers, which came out in 2010, and Let's Rock, which came out in 2019 at the end of the decade. And there are 2 albums that came out in between times there, which actually was El Camino, which was 2011, and Turn Blue, which I think was 2015, maybe 2014. Anyway, those 2 albums, one of them's on my list, one of them's not on my list. But anyway, for the point I'm trying to make, I don't know if we're going to have a band that has multiple albums on this list. In my head, it's kind of hard to justify that because I can look at the Black Keys albums, the 2 that I really like, again, Brothers and Let's Rock. I can look at those and say to myself that I think Let's Rock is the better album. So if I put it personally in my own list of Black Keys albums over Brothers, that I don't think that I would put Brothers on this list. And it's kind of hard to justify that because I do really love both of those albums. And maybe the Black Keys are a bad example to do this with because I want to debate with myself a little bit more about between Let's Rock and Brothers. But for the point I'm trying to make, in my head, I want all 12 spots to be filled with a different band. And I know that that's kind of a terrible thing to say and put on the list before we even start it, but that's just kind of the way my brain works. I want to showcase as many bands as possible, and in my own head, it's tough to have 2 albums from the same band on there because I clearly know which one's better than the other. So we'll see how the whole list plays out, but I wanted to talk a little bit about that up front here. So for Black Keys albums, Brothers and Let's Rock, I want to discuss those a little bit more between myself because my initial impression is to say that I do like Let's Rock better, and that's what I said in my 2019 list. However, Brothers is like a seminal album for me, and an album that got me into a whole genre of music, sort of the more gritty, dirty, bluesy pop music, sort of that the more analog based, every sound is run through some sort of like a filter or analog sort of emulator to make everything sound dirty and gritty and have granules to it almost. It's a weird way to explain it, but because of that, I'm going to make both of those Black Keys albums this pink color. So I know to kind of include them, and I'll just go find the Black Keys album over here. Let's Rock. It was my number 1 for 2019. And so I'm going to have to fight with myself over that. And as we go down 2010, you can look here and see we've got, Linkin Park, Birthday Massacre, which is kind of another interesting thing that I'll talk a little bit more about later. Codeine Velvet Club, Minus the Bear, Raunchy, and here we get to something that is going to maybe be an outlier. And this, I will admit, I have thought about this before doing this video. This album, Raunchy's album, A Discord Electric, that came out in 2010, is one of my favorite metal albums of all time. And if I were to remake this 2010 list, I would probably make it differently and move that one up. However, those 3 albums, Pendulum, BT, and the Black Keys, albums from that year are so good, I don't think that it would have cracked the top 3. I definitely would have put it at number 4. But I'm not going back and changing any of these lists. They exist as they were as a time capsule of how I was feeling at that time. However, I like this album enough that I'm going to take it and make it pink and kind of include it in the conversation. I don't know if it's going to make it or not, but we'll have to see. So we have already, just in starting the first year here, a bit of an anomaly at the bottom. So now might be a good time to mention, why am I going through the list doing this? Isn't it just going to end up being your number 1s for the whole year and then 2 number 2s possibly? And you could look at it that way, but that would be more of a mathematical way of looking at it. And I'm going to try to approach this from more of a what I like and looking at it retrospectively, what I like now. And so there's going to be some years that I think are way better and some years that weren't as good. So we might have a year with nothing from it, for example, and we'll just kind of have to see how that goes as we go on. So it'll be interesting to look at sort of like trends, I guess, in terms of how good a year was and how generally for me every year it was pretty easy to pick my top 5 or so. And then after that, it was just kind of like, what did I enjoy the most? And then how much I enjoyed it compared to other stuff from that year. So I know pretty well how much I like all of the top stuff on the list. So now if we look at 2011 here, we've got Globus, which in my opinion, as I said in my 2019 or my 2011 video, which actually now that we're getting to 2011, if you haven't gone back and watched my 2011 video that I just released recently, my original list for 2011 got lost because I made a video for it back in 2011, posted it to YouTube, and it got copywritten because I just included some music samples in there. And I ended up taking it down, and I haven't looked at the video in years, and the one hard drive that it was residing on actually crashed for me a few weeks ago. So rather than be upset about it and try to remember what I did for my list, I sat down and made a new list. And so my 2011 list is something that I've just recently figured out. And I know it's different than it was from when it was originally, but there you go. Circumstances dictated that. So Globus, one of my favorite albums of all time, and I think maybe the most impressive album I've ever heard, definitely is going to be Blue. Whoops, different color blue. Doesn't really matter, but Within Temptation, TU, that stands for The Unforgiven. It's my favorite Within Temptation album, and I think maybe going to end up being the only symphonic metal album on this list. And symphonic metal is one of my favorite genres, if not my favorite genre of music, and I think also one of the most impressive genres of music because it takes and mixes everything you know about metal music and rock music in general, and then adds the sort of extra layer of soaring female vocals, which rock and metal can have, but then also includes the orchestral instrumentation. So like having someone having to do actual orchestration for each song, having big bombastic sounds and slower ballads with luscious strings and choirs and things like that. To me, everything that goes into making an album is a factor. And that's where we're getting kind of into how I look at music, whether subjectively or objectively. And obviously it's easy for me to look at music subjectively. I know what I like and I can tell you why I like it. But one of the reasons that I do like certain things is the amount of work that was put into creating it. And I think that when you have an album that has full string section, full orchestra, and a choir, you're talking about something that had significantly more effort being put into it. Now, at the same time, a really badly made, badly written, badly produced song with a bunch of elements might not be as good as a very well-written, simple acoustic guitar song. And it's kind of hard to take those two things and judge them against each other, but that's what I'm going to have to do while I'm thinking about this. But back to Within Temptation here. This is my favorite Within Temptation album, one of my favorite symphonic metal albums of all time, one of my favorite sort of metal-y pop metal albums of all time. But I don't know if it's going to be good enough. There's a lot of really good stuff on this list. So I'm going to take it and I'm going to make it pink rather than blue. Then right underneath it, again, the top 3, Hurts Happiness. This is where we're getting into some difficult stuff because there's 2 Hurts albums that came out in this decade. There's all 4 of Hurts albums have come out in this decade. And I like all 4 of them a lot. In fact, I maybe giving Hurts my sort of award, whatever that is, for best band of the decade because I think they released 4 phenomenal albums with not a single second of bad stuff on it. And I think that the more I think about it, the more I like their second album the most. And so I'm going to take and ignore their first album, which came out in 2011 called Happiness, as you can see here. And I'm going to just leave that and not include it because I'm going to include their second album, which came out in 2013, and something that I found later, not during the year, something that I found later and is way over here in this end section, their album Exile. I'm going to take and make that one. I want to make it blue because I love it so much, but I think I'm going to have to make it pink for now, and then I'll have to discuss it with myself later. So let's go back over to 2011. I don't think there's going to be anything else in this list. Again, I just did it recently. I don't think there's going to be anything else in here that I think is going to end up making it. So let's move over to 2012. Number 1, we have Kaiser's Orchestra. I have here listed Volume 3. Of course, that's the third album in the trilogy Violetta Violetta Volume 3. Violetta Violetta. So there was Violetta Violetta Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3. And it was really neat because in 2011 they released 2 albums, and then at the end of, I think it was, the first album came out at the beginning of 2011, and then the second volume came out at the beginning of 2012, and then at the very end of 2012 was Volume 3. Anyway, it doesn't matter. For the purposes of this list, Volume 3 made it up here into my top 12. It's my number 1, actually, for 2012. And I'm going to have to make it blue because it's one of the most amazing albums I've ever heard, and I'll discuss it more later. Now, the Cell Dweller album, we have 2 Cell Dweller albums that have come out in this decade. In 2012, they released WUABS, which stands for Wish Upon a Black Star. And then in 2015, we have End of an Empire. I personally like Wish Upon a Black Star better. I don't know if Cell Dweller is going to make it, but I like it, and I think it's good enough that it deserves to be a pink in the conversation. So, Imagine Dragons, Matchbox, Birthday Massacre, I don't think so. This Grace Potter album, Grace Potter and the Nocturnals, that is their album, The Lion, the Beast, and the Beat, which came out in 2012, like I said. This album is one that, looking back retroactively, I definitely would have made it a lot higher on the list, and I think that it probably would have ended up at my number 3 spot. So it's interesting to think about it that way. However, Grace Potter, later on here, you'll see, in 2015, has a solo album that I think is better than this album down here. So what I'm going to do, and actually I don't even know if either of them are going to make it, but that is such a fantastic album. I think I'm going to take and make the Grace Potter one pink and ignore, for now, this Grace Potter one and the one with the Nocturnals with their band. We have the Last Ever Onhilig album. We have a Good Nephew album. Mook is a Japanese metal band that we're going to see later on. I think I'm going to have in my... It's going to be blue. It's going to definitely be on the list, I think. Shiny Toy Guns, Gangsta Grass. Okay, moving on to 2013 here. Maximum the Hormone. Their album Yoshu Fukushu, I believe, is going to be a blue. I think it's one of the best metal albums I've ever heard. Talk about it more later. Arctic Monkeys. We're going to get to the first number 2 here that I don't think is deserving to be on my list of the decade, or even in the conversation, really. I liked it more at the time than I do now, though I do think it's a great album. At the time, this was the closest thing I've come to hearing another band sound kind of like the Black Keys, with the exception of a couple that I also like the Hurts, for example. But anyway, We Butter the Bread with Butter, which is what WBTBWB stands for. We Butter the Bread with Butter is going to end up being... They have 2 albums that came out this decade, and I don't think either of them are going to make my list. I think that this album that came out in 2013, which is called Goldkinder, is better than their album that came out later in the year. And this was one that I was debating about so much, knowing that I was going to have to do this list and this video specifically, that I went back and listened to it. And while I do love it, it's a very cool combination of this sort of stereotypical German metal, sort of a German industrial metal like Oomph or Rammstein. But it mixes in clear Depeche Mode influence and then some cool Sonic the Hedgehog sounding Sega Genesis era synth sounds. And I love it. The album's great. It's all in German. And it's great. One of my favorite metal albums, but I don't think it's as good as either this Maximum the Hormone album or even, if we scroll back down here, that Raunchy album that I said was one of my favorite metal albums as well. I think that both of those albums are better. And again, it's not that you can't have more than 2 or 3 metal bands or metal albums on this list, but I don't think that it's good enough to make it there, knowing in my head that we have already 2 other metal albums that I think are better than it. So we're going to ignore that one for now. Morchiba, great album. Soilwork, that's probably my favorite Soilwork album was released this whole decade, but I don't think it's good enough to make it. It's a double album, and if you took my favorite songs off of both discs and made one album, it's silly to say, but I think I would almost like it more. But I enjoy all the songs. I think that Soilwork's best album, though, came in the previous decade. So that's interesting. I do still think it's good, but not going to make it. Mayday, it's funny as I look at this because I see this C6 Steve album here, and I think there's no way now I would think that album is better than these last 4 albums, especially not like the Mesh and Volbeat Gary Newman albums. And Ghost Brothers of Darkland County was a really cool project, and I enjoyed it at the time, but I don't think that it's as good as maybe some of this other stuff. But seeing C6 Steve there is cool. Like, it was a novel at the time that I found it a novelty, and I still enjoy it, but not as much as that. But anyway, nothing else that year. So now we're getting to 2014 and 2015. And one cool thing about 2014 and 2015 was during those 2 years, I was doing a music podcast with my friend Chris. And so throughout the year, as we were doing the episodes, we kept mentioning to each other, oh, is this something that we found that's new that's going to be on our list? So it was something I thought about more that year than any of these other years, I think, those 2 years. And at the end of the year, we did several episodes. I think it was 3 parts both years. 3-part episodes of just going through our list and playing a song and talking about it. And it was really great and really fun to do that. And so these lists are really important and special to me, but there's also some interesting stuff on them. So And One Trilogy, my number 1 album of 2014, is actually a triple album released by one of my favorite synth bands or electronic bands, And One, who actually also this decade, released an album that I love in 2010, which I kind of glanced over here. Where did it go? Or 2011, sorry. And One, Tanzomat, right here. And then later on, they released an album called Stop, which I've included over here in my Discovered after the year it came out. And that album, it's interesting because all 3 of these And One albums are fantastic. And I think that all 3 of them are up to par with each other. However, their album from 2014, Trilogy, is a triple album. So it has 3 discs. Each one is sort of a different style of electronic music. One is sort of the more poppy, happy 80s sounding songs. One is more sort of like Depeche Mode influenced with a guitar on each song. And then one of his more industrial, sort of aggressive German electronic music. And I love them all. It's all great. Half the songs I think on the whole album are German, or maybe a little more in English, but still a mix of German and English songs. Great stuff. In this case, for this video, we're definitely making it a blue. It's going to be on the list, I think. Now, just last night, I was thinking about this raunchy album that I mentioned back here in 2010. And then the only other album they released this whole decade, which is from 2014 here. Vices, Virtues, Visions. Fantastic album. I think I got to make it pink. We'll see what happens. Demon Hunter of that same year, we're going to make this one pink. I think that's Demon Hunter's best album, and I think it deserves it. I don't know if it's going to make the list, but I'll have to discuss it. The Pierces, 2014, their album Creation. One of my favorite albums of all time. And I know I've said that a lot at this point in this video, and it probably doesn't mean anything anymore, but such good pop music, reminiscent of the Mamas and the Papas, great vocal harmonies coming from the 2 sisters, great songwriting. Every song on that album is just absolutely great song. They had an album also come out in 2011, which I love as well, but I don't think is as strong as their one from 2014, which, by the way, is called Creation. So I'm going to make that one pink, and I think that one might end up being in my blue. Lights from 2014. This is her album Little Machines. Love it. Loved it at the time a lot. Probably would be higher on my list if I did it now, but I don't think that it's going to make the cut. If I could combine that album, Little Machines with Midnight Machines, which she came out with the year after. That one is it's all the songs from Little Machines, but done acoustically. If I could combine those two and make them one album, it would absolutely be on the list. But separate, they're just enough to not be on the list. And I don't think there's anything else worth talking about in 2014. 2015, we come to another anomaly here. Zac Brown Band, my number one for 2015. Of all the Zac Brown Band albums, this one is not my favorite. It's not the one that I listen to the most when I think about I want to listen to Zac Brown Band. This is actually probably the last one I would think to put on. However, at the time, and I still agree with this, it's one of the most impressive albums I've ever heard. This album is like they channeled the spirits of the Wrecking Crew and decided that they were going to treat each song as its own individual thing and do whatever they could to make each song as good as possible. And they did things that are amazing on that album. I think the musicianship is incredible. They go through genre after genre after genre after genre of different song, and it's so impressive that at the time, and even still now, I think deserved the number one spot that year. However, I don't think it's going to end up on my list at all. I included at the end here, in this last section, their album, What You Get, What You Get, What You Give, their White Album. I actually like that album better than Jekyll and Hyde, which is their one from 2015. So, but again, I don't know if either of those albums is going to make it. Actually, as I'm sitting here thinking about it, knowing what we already have and what's coming, it's not going to. I think those are both great albums, but I don't think that they are deserving of it. So we've already got Grace Potter here in 2015. I already sort of talked about Cell Dweller's album. As we go down, Elle King, great, some production problems on it, so not necessarily, I don't think, deserving. Here we come to our second Hertz album of the decade that I had it on my list. 2 years before this, in 2013, they released Exile, and that's my favorite of their albums. And I think Surrender is actually the weakest of all their albums, but again, still fantastic. Toby Mac that year was great. The Arcs, really cool band. Here's the other We Butter the Bread with Butter album, but I don't think it's as good, or at least not deserving. So now we're at 2016, Mesh. This is their album Looking Skyward. Mesh has released 2 perfect albums in their career, and thank God the one that I believe is most perfect came out in 2009. So I don't even have to think about it in regards to this list. However, this album came out in 2016. It was my number one. I'm going to make that one a pink, but it'll probably end up being in it. July Talk, we're going to make that a pink as well, though I don't think that it's going to be in it. Volbeat from that year was the best Volbeat album that they've ever released, but I don't think it's going to make it. The Heavy, first time they've appeared on these lists, I discovered them a little later in the decade, and they have some earlier albums that might be on the list, that would definitely be on the separate lists from the year, but not enough to make it onto this list. Julian K, I believe that would have been California Noir Volume 1. Good stuff, but not. Frost, this Marilena Bertoldi album, fantastic album. I found out about it during the Olympics that year. The Summer Olympics were happening in Rio, and they had a commercial for a car. I forget what brand it was, but there was a sweet song playing, and I was like, I love this song. So I looked for like a month trying to figure out what this song was. I didn't have the Shazam or anything like that to like Shazam a song. And I eventually found out that it was Marilena Bertoldi, a lady who is famous in Mexico for being in a band called Eruca Sativa, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but sort of a very heavy, sort of bluesy, rock-influenced band. And then she went and made her first solo album, or second solo album, and it's called Sexo con Modelos, and it is a fantastic album. It's a little short, and there's a couple of songs on it that are a little bit wishy-washy in my opinion, but so good, and something that I wanted to mention while going through this list because I'm not going to talk about them anymore. One Republic, good stuff that year. This is the Lights album that I was talking about from the year before. Oh, which Lights album is that? That would have been Midnight Machines. So she must have released it 2 years later. That's interesting. Anyway, it doesn't matter. That's Midnight Machines that I was talking about. Epica, another symphonic metal band, but not going to make it. So we move on to 2017 here. This Janov, he is the lead singer for the band Kaiser's Orchestra, which is my number one album from 2012, the Violetta Violetta Volume 3. They knew that this was going to be their last album. And so they made it as sort of their swan song, and it's one of the greatest albums I've ever heard. However, if you asked me what my number one most favorite album is, as of right now, I would say Janov's album from 2017, Artisten and Marlene. They're from Norway, the band, and Janov is from Norway. All the songs are in Norwegian. But that is my number one favorite album actually right now, and I'm going to make it blue because it definitely deserves to be on there. Evanescence, I think, is going to be pink. That's their synthesis album with the all orchestra, like a greatest hits of all their songs, redone with just orchestra and synths. And electronic drums, no guitars or anything like that. Absolutely beautiful, amazing album. Mook, Japanese metal band. This is their best album, and it's called Miyahaku, or Miyaku Haku, I believe is how you pronounce it, though I could be totally wrong. I don't speak Japanese, even though all the lyrics are in Japanese. I love albums that are in languages other than English, even though I speak is English, because I like to sort of be free from the burden of having to relate to the lyrics. I like to just think of the vocals as another instrument in the song and listening to how it works with everything. That's my personal preference. But anyway, Mook, their album Miyaku Haku, my favorite of their albums, and I think something that's going to deserve to be on the list, but I'm going to make it pink instead. Depeche Mode, we got 2 Depeche Mode albums this decade. They release an album every 4 years. Both of them are fantastic. I think they're 2 best Depeche Mode albums. However, I don't think they stack up against this other stuff. I think if you're talking about bands that I love as a whole, Depeche Mode would have to maybe be number one because they've released so much music over the course of their 30, 40-year career at this point. Their first album came out in 1980, 80, 90, 2000, 2010, 2020, 40-year career at this point. They've released so much more music than a lot of my other favorite bands that just based on sheer numbers, they would have to be in the talks for favorite band. But there are 2 albums they released this decade, my 2 favorites, but not included in this list. The Stan Tyminski album is great. And then this is the last Birthday Massacre album on my list, so I want to talk about them for a sec. Because if you ask me what my favorite band was, right now, I would say Kaiser's Orchestra / Janov, that we just talked about. And then number 2 spot, kind of depending on how I feel. I love the metal band Raunchy. We talked about them in 2010. I also love the metal band Mook, which we just talked about up here. But for a long, long, long time, my favorite band, I always said, was the Birthday Massacre. And I still love them so much. They released 4 albums this decade, but I don't think that it was the best album they'd released. I don't think any of them was the best album they released. And their best album came from 2007, and it was called Walking with Strangers. And I think that they kind of became a little stale. However, them being stale just means that they're still making the exact same music that I love, that they're the only band that I know of that makes the music like that they do. So I wanted to just shout them out and mention them here because I don't think they're going to be in my conversation for Album of the Year, which is disappointing to me. However, they're more of a consistency with me and not so much peaks and lows. And this list to me that we're making right now is more of a highs. Albums where just the perfect combination of people, timing, everything came together and create this amazing, incredible work of art that stands alone on its own and is just so incredible. That to me is what makes an incredible album. And the Birthday Massacre makes great albums, and over the course of their career, I think they're incredible. But maybe individual albums not as incredible as some of these albums we're talking about. Another Lights album came out in 2017. I think that was Skin and Bones. Or Skin and Earth. But anyway. Gorillaz album, not the best album. Kind of disappointing, actually, at the end of this year. I remember that specifically. So 2018, we have Janov again. This I totally regret putting on my list. I was cheating at the time. I was just so excited about it. He released a series of 2 EPs. Each one was about the length of a full album. But I think that... Hold on, I gotta check how many minutes I got left. Oh my God, 5 minutes. I might have to do this in 2 parts. Anyway, we got Janov, these 2 EPs, not going to be included. Legend is going to be pink. And I think... Hold on a second. Jen Wigmore. When did her album come out? Did Gravel and Wine come out in 2011 or 2010? I don't know. I thought it was 2010. How could it not have been on my list? Okay, I'm calling an audible. I'm going to have to look this up after the video, but for now we're going to go Jen Wigmore, Gravel, where's the and? Gravel and Wine. Whoops. Dumb. There you go, Gravel and Wine. Fantastic album. Talk about it more in my other video. We're going to make that one pink. Now we got... Yeah, that threw me off for a loop. Okay. Mike Shinoda, Another El King, Blue October, Seven Dust. Disappointing at the end of this year. 2019, fantastic year. Black Keys, we already got it. Jesse Wilson, 100% is going to be a pink. Don't know if it's going to make it, but fantastic. Look at my video for 2019 to hear me talk more about that. I'm running out of camera time here. So when we go over here to this, we got Nephew, Ring E-Ring. I'm making that purple or pink. Hertz, Desire, no. And One, we already talked about that. Jacob Dylan. When I was going through all my albums and looking for the ones that came out this decade that didn't make my list, when I saw that album came out in 2010, it was devastating because it is one of the greatest albums I've ever heard, and I don't know if it's going to make the list. I can't even wrap my head around the fact that it came out this decade. I would have told you it was significantly before that, but it is. Editor's Violence, fantastic album that I found the year after it came out, and I think I'm going to make that one pink as well. Tooth Grinder, Phantom Amour is going to be pink as well. Obviously, I have a little bit of a prejudice, I guess, kind of again for these albums, not prejudice, but I have a favoritism, I guess, for some of these albums because I specifically went through and had to make the choice. Do I think they deserve to be on the list? So I'm going to include those. They're from all different years. And Zac Brown Band's not going to make it. So I know this video was very higgledy-piggledy, and I was trying to gather my thoughts as I was recording. However, the main purpose of this was I wanted to show my whole list. So I don't even know if you can see it, but I wanted to show all my lists, all 120 albums plus an extra 9, so 129 albums that I considered for being the best albums of the decade. And I love everything that's on this list. That's on this whole sheet. That's why I included it on my original lists. However, I think that I feel good about everything that we have here. It's interesting, if you look, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 albums that I think definitely deserve to be on the list, which means that I'm only going to be able to pick 5 out of these pink albums here. So it is going to be really tough to do that, but that's another video. So be on the lookout for that video. Be on the lookout for more of my top 12 albums of the decade, and then eventually be on the lookout for my top 12 albums of the decade. Thank you very much.
You see it?
Look at her.
Oh, Lucy, but I mean the squirrel.
I know, we can't see the squirrel.
Yeah.
What a ding dong. Hello, everybody. In this really... Here are the... How many are that in there? Hello, everyone. Here are the albums that are in contention for my top 12 albums of the decade. Wow, these are getting way wetter than I thought. Try to do something nice for people, and it doesn't work out. Really.